We're not going to see a housing crash in Ottawa until we see an influx of people, like thousands and thousands and thousands of people who can't afford their mortgages or have no choice but to sell their properties. It's not high prices that cause a housing crash. People have called Ottawa homes overpriced or too expensive since before COVID, and we all know that prices went up very sharply during that period. What actually makes housing prices fall is something else. It's actually a few factors, and those show up months before prices make any sort of move. Most buyers and owners are not even watching most of these stats. So in this video, I'm going to show you what really makes home prices drop quickly. I'll show you what the early warning signs are, and I'll show you what you would actually see to know if Ottawa is heading towards a sharp price correction or a crash. Now, a quick disclaimer to say that some of the stuff that causes crashes or big changes in the housing market are things that we can't see coming, things like pandemics or wars or natural disasters. I can't comment on that stuff, obviously. I don't know when those things are going to happen. What I am going to tie this to is stats that we track every single month, either through the Ottawa Real Estate Board or the Canadian Real Estate Association, and what those numbers would need to do in order to make it more likely that we're going to see a crash in the short to medium term. Now, the place to start is to recognize that a price is just a number that a buyer and seller agree on for the property. For that number to fall quickly, you don't need homes to necessarily just get too expensive. You need sellers who have to sell faster than buyers would normally want to buy. A seller who doesn't like the offer that they get when they put their home on the market, who isn't in a position where they have to sell, is just going to take it off the market a lot of the time and wait until the market improves. This is something we've seen a lot in Ottawa lately. I've found with older people selling their detached properties. They'd like to sell their home and move to a smaller place, but they've still got their mobility and they're not in a position where they have to let it go yet if they aren't going to get a price that makes sense for them. A forced seller, by contrast, just can't wait. Somebody who's lost their job or is going through a separation or has to make a move for work, those are the people that are going to sell the property and take whatever the market is willing to bear, even if it's an ugly number. And those sold prices, if enough of them happen, set a new comparable benchmark for the neighborhood. Anybody who goes to buy a similar property is going to reference those numbers going forward, and buyers will be unwilling to pay much more than that because that's where the market is at now. The perfect example of this is the 2008 market crash in the US. This wasn't a crash just because homes got too pricey, although they obviously were. It was a flood of forced sellers who hit the market all at once. People's loans reset, people lost their jobs because the economy was collapsing, and the rules allowed them to walk away from the house. Without getting into too much detail, the rules I'm talking about are the non-recourse mortgage rules in the States, which basically meant that the bank could only go after the house as collateral for a mortgage. So if you had a house that had a $500,000 mortgage on it, and after prices collapsed, the house was only worth $400,000, it made a lot more sense to just hand the keys back to the bank and walk away. And once the bank took back all those houses, they obviously aren't going to live in them, so all of those properties that the sellers walked away from hit the market all at once and drove prices into the ground. Now, just because high prices aren't the primary cause of a crash doesn't mean affordability doesn't matter. It actually definitely plays a role in creating the conditions necessary for a crash to happen. And in Canada, the way we measure affordability is by measuring what percentage of the average paycheck in a city is required to pay the average mortgage. And that number in Ottawa right now is about 43%. It takes about 43% of the average middle income to pay the typical mortgage in our city. Now, what's considered normal is 33%. So yes, people are stretched a little more thin right now than is ideal. But the part I find that surprises most people is over the last couple of years, it's actually been getting easier, not harder from an affordability perspective. And in Ottawa specifically, we are in far better shape than markets like Toronto, where it takes 71% of the average income, or Vancouver, where it takes a whopping 82%. This is all according to a National Bank report published for Q1 of 2026. So in Ottawa, we're actually doing relatively well as far as how much of the monthly income it takes. I've found the real wall, especially for first-time homebuyers, is the down payment. Saving up a typical down payment in Ottawa takes about 4 years at a normal savings rate if you're looking for an actual house. For a condo, it's more like 2 years. So how does this all fit into the market crash equation? I would call the stretched budget as kind of the dry wood or kindling that decides how big a market crash could get. It's not the match that starts the collapse, but it creates the conditions where the collapse could be really severe. A stretched market can just sit there for years though, and ours has been this way for quite a while. Now, if affordability is the kindling, the match to start the fire is missed payments. A delinquency is someone who has fallen behind on their mortgage, and here's why that matters. This is a real sign that the willing owners are turning into forced sellers. And while affordability is definitely something you want to keep an eye on to see how bad a potential crash could get, an increase in the delinquency rate is what's going to show you that something bad is actually on the way and starting to happen. Now, in Ontario, to be honest, there's actually some real reason for concern here. We're still at a very low percentage of overall delinquencies. Only 0.36% of mortgages are in any sort of delinquency, but that's up 52% from last year. Now, it's up 52% from a very low number, so don't head for the hills yet. But a 52% increase in the amount of delinquencies is something that's worth paying attention to and being concerned about. The way I would read this right now is that the jump is real. The 52% is something to keep an eye on, and I definitely respect that that's there. But that's a 52% increase on a very tiny amount of mortgage delinquencies. Now, the thing to watch is whether or not this number goes up as we get into the renewal wave that everyone's been anticipating in 2026. Over 1 million Canadian mortgages are renewing off of very low pandemic rates that they took in 2021 and 2022. And when a payment jumps at renewal and someone can't keep up, that willing owner becomes a forced seller and that person becomes a delinquency statistic eventually. So this delinquency rate is something that you should definitely continue to watch and see if those people who are renewing are starting to show up in the delinquencies. It can take a few months for that to happen, for them to fall behind enough on their payments to show up in those stats. Now, one thing to note about Ottawa specifically that can make you feel a little bit better is that our economy leans pretty heavily on government jobs. That has kept us safer than places like Toronto and Vancouver, where more people tend to fall behind on their payments. And while there have been announcements of government job cuts over the last couple of years, a lot of this is being done through attrition and freezing hiring. So it's not going to be people suddenly losing their jobs and their ability to make their mortgage payments, but it definitely isn't helping the situation. So if what we're watching to determine whether or not there's going to be a crash is forced sellers against willing buyers, the months of inventory is the scoreboard. If you've been on this channel before, you know that I do not shut up about months of inventory. And what months of inventory is the number of properties that are sitting on the market at the end of the month divided by the rate at which those properties are selling. A higher number means that there's more supply and less demand, which tends to push prices down. This is the main stat that comes out every month that's easily accessible that I think you should pay close attention to, because this, to me, is the best leading indicator of where prices are going. Watching prices is important, and that's what actually tells us whether or not the crash is happening. Like, that's what we're looking for, is prices going down. But price is a slow signal, kind of a lagging indicator. The leading indicator, the fast signal that's going to change and tell you that prices are about to come down, is months of inventory, driven by the other factors that we've just spoken about. The other thing to note is that Ottawa is not all one market. From the latest numbers that I pull from Habistat, apartment condos are around 5 months of inventory, which leans towards a buyer's market. Condo towns are about 3.8 months, which is just into seller's market territory, technically. And freehold townhomes are at 2.4 months of inventory, which is firmly in seller's market. So a crash is never going to be the whole city at once in Ottawa, more than likely. One type of home can be sliding while another stays tight. And I would argue that condos, specifically apartment condos, are already at a very high risk of some sort of price crash. So when someone asks if the Ottawa market is crashing, the honest answer has to start with which market in Ottawa are you talking about? Because Ottawa as a whole doesn't really have one answer. The main thing that I would look for is months of inventory going up several months in a row, like an actual trend, not just an off month. So if you see months of inventory steadily climbing for a section of the market, that's your first red flag. Missed payments and an increased delinquency rate is the number 2 thing to watch out for, especially this year in 2026, when we're expecting a lot of lower rate mortgages to renew at higher rates and therefore create higher payments. And the late stage final sign to pay attention to is if you noticed more forced sales. Things like estate sales, people moving for jobs, or power of sales from foreclosures. People who cannot afford to wait, People who are going to sell those homes no matter what. That is the final nail in the coffin that's going to cause a crash if we're going to see one. And we need to see that number jump substantially in order to see the kind of crash that people are afraid of. Right now, the weaker parts of the market are definitely softening and worth paying close attention to, and missed payments are rising, but they are still low, generally speaking. The main thing I want you to take away from this is that a housing crash is not like a monster that's hiding under your bed that's going to come out of nowhere, unless it's prompted by some major world event that's beyond our control. It's a slow process, and it leaves clues months or years ahead. Once you know what those signals are to watch for, you can stop panicking about the scary headlines and just study the numbers to get a good idea of what direction things are going in. There are reasons for concern, and there's real softness in our market right now, but it's not as bad as a lot of people make it out to be. And in many cases, it's very isolated to particular sections of the market. If the stats are something that you want to keep a close eye on, I track these numbers every month for each individual section of the market. So get subscribed to the channel if you want to see what months of inventory, prices, days on market, those sorts of things are doing. Thanks so much for taking the time to watch, and have a fantastic rest of your day. Take care.